In the spring of 1969, Harold Finch drove his pickup truck down a gravel road in Clayton County, Iowa, and parked at the edge of what locals called the most cursed piece of farmland in the state. The field stretched out before him, 120 acres of brown, dead-looking soil where nothing had grown properly in 30 years. The grass along the fence line was thin and yellow. The few weeds that managed to survive looked sick. Even the trees at the far edge seemed to lean away from the field, as if they knew something was wrong. Harold was 26 years old. He had $12,000 in savings, every penny he'd earned working other people's farms since he was 16. He was about to spend most of it on this land. Everyone thought he was insane. "You know what they call this place?" his father had asked when Harold first mentioned his plan. "The cursed Finch Field." "I know. And you know we're not related to those Finches? It's just a coincidence of names?" "I know, Dad. And you know that 3 families have tried to farm this land since 1942, and all 3 went broke." "I know. Then why in God's name would you buy it?" Harold had looked at his father and smiled. "Because I want to know why. Let me tell you about the cursed Finch Field, because that's what everyone called it. The original owner was a man named Elmer Finch, no relation to Harold, who'd homesteaded the land For the first 40 years, the farm did fine. Not spectacular, but fine. Elmer raised corn and hogs, built a decent house, raised a family. Then, sometime in the late 1930s, things started to go wrong. The crops got weaker. Yields dropped. By 1940, Elmer was barely growing enough to feed his animals, let alone sell at market. By 1942, he was broke. The bank took the land, and Elmer Finch moved to town, where he died 2 years later of a broken heart, people said. The second owner was a family named Patterson. They bought the land cheap in 1945, figuring the previous owner had just been unlucky or lazy. They weren't unlucky or lazy. They worked that land hard for 8 years. Same result. Crops withered. Yields collapsed. The Pattersons went broke in The third owner was a man named Davis, a successful farmer from 2 counties over who thought he knew better than the locals. He bought the Finch Field in 1955 and threw everything he had at it. New equipment, new techniques, new fertilizers. Nothing worked. Davis lasted 7 years before the bank took his farm too. By 1962, nobody would touch the Finch Field. It sat empty, owned by the bank, a brown scar on the green Iowa landscape. People drove past it and shook their heads. "Cursed land," they'd say. "Something wrong with that soil, always has been." The asking price dropped, $200 an acre, then a $150, then a $100. By 1969, the bank was willing to sell it for $80 an acre, less than half what good farmland cost in Clayton County. That's when Harold Finch came along. Let me tell you about Harold, because he wasn't like other farmers. Harold had grown up on his family's farm outside Elcotter, about 20 miles from the cursed field. He'd learned to drive a tractor at 8, helped with planting at 12, taken over the evening chores at 14. By the time he graduated high school, he knew farming as well as any man in the county. But Harold had also done something unusual for a farm kid in 1960s Iowa. He'd taken correspondence courses from Iowa State University. Not for a degree, he couldn't afford that, but for knowledge. He'd studied soil science, agronomy, plant biology. He'd read textbooks that most farmers didn't know existed. The courses cost him $300 over 4 years. They taught him something that would be worth far more than that. They taught him to ask questions. Most farmers, Harold knew, operated on tradition and instinct. They did what their fathers had done, what their grandfathers had done. If something worked, they kept doing it. If something failed, they blamed the weather or bad luck or God's will. Harold learned that there was usually a reason. Not luck, not curses, reasons. Scientific, measurable, fixable reasons. When he heard about the Finch Field, he didn't hear a curse. He heard a question. Why doesn't anything grow there? Now, let me tell you about the purchase, because that's when everyone started laughing. Harold walked into the Clayton County Bank on a Tuesday morning in March of 1969 and told the loan officer he wanted to buy the Finch field. The loan officer, a man named Warren Jeffries, looked at Harold like he'd announced plans to burn his money in the parking lot. "Son, you know about that land? I know it's been fallow for 7 years. It's been cursed for 30. 3 families ruined. Nobody can grow anything on it. That's what I've heard. And you want to buy it anyway?" "Yes, sir. I have $9,600 in cash. That's $80 an acre for 120 acres. Warren leaned back in his chair. "Your money, I suppose. But I'm going to need you to sign a paper saying I advised against this. Don't want your family coming back later saying we took advantage of a young fool." Harold signed the paper. He signed the deed. He handed over almost everything he had. Walking out of the bank, he ran into Glenn Mercer, the John Deere dealer, who'd sold equipment to his father for 20 years. "Harold, heard you just bought land. Congratulations. Where's the property?" "The Finch field." Glenn's smile froze. Then he started laughing, not a polite chuckle, but a real belly laugh that turned heads on the street. "The Finch field? The cursed land? Harold, I wouldn't take that dirt if you paid me to haul it away. That soil is dead, has been for decades. You just threw away $10,000. Maybe, we'll see." "We'll see?" Glenn laughed harder. "Son, there's nothing to see. 3 families already saw. They saw their crops die, and their savings disappear, and their dreams turn to dust. You'll see the same thing inside of 2 years. Harold just nodded and walked to his truck. Glenn's laughter followed him down the street. "Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had everyone tell you that something was impossible? Have you ever had experts and experienced people laugh at your plans? Most people in that situation start to doubt themselves. They figure that if everyone agrees something can't be done, it probably can't be done." Harold Finch thought differently. He thought, if everyone agrees something can't be done, and they're all doing the same thing, then maybe the thing that can't be done is the thing they're all doing. Nobody had fixed the Finch field, but had anybody actually tried to understand it? Let me tell you about the soil test, 'cause that's where the mystery got solved. The first thing Harold did when he took possession of the land was dig. Not to plant, not yet, but to understand. He walked the entire 120 acres with a shovel, digging small holes every 50 yards or so, looking at the soil. What he saw puzzled him. The soil wasn't sandy or rocky or full of clay, all things that could make farming difficult. It was good. Iowa loam, dark and deep, the kind of soil that should grow corn like nowhere else on earth. But it was wrong somehow. The color was slightly off, more gray than black, and when Harold crumbled it in his fingers, it felt different than healthy soil. Thin, lifeless, like the earth itself was sick. Harold remembered something from his correspondence courses, something about soil chemistry and pH levels, something about what happened when soil became too acidic or too alkaline. He drove to the county extension office the next day. The extension agent was a young man named Paul Hendricks, fresh out of Iowa State, eager to help. Most farmers never visited the extension office. They thought it was for book-learning types who didn't understand real farming. Harold was one of the few who saw it as a resource. "I need to test my soil," Harold said. "Happy to help. Which field?" "The Finch place." Paul's eyebrows rose. "You bought the Finch place?" "Just closed on it yesterday." That's interesting." Paul was too polite to say what he was thinking. "What exactly are you testing for?" "Everything, but especially pH." Paul nodded slowly. Something sparked in his eyes. "You know, I've always wondered about that field. Drove past it 100 times, never could figure out why nothing grows there. Did anyone ever test it?" Paul pulled out the county records. He flipped through pages going back years, decades. Finally he looked up. "No, nobody ever tested it, at least not through this office." "Never?" "Never. 3 families farmed that land. All 3 failed, and not one of them ever sent in a soil sample." Harold felt a chill run down his spine. 30 years. 3 families ruined. And nobody had ever asked the most basic question, what's wrong with the dirt? Let's fix that, Harold said. Paul gave him the sample bags and instructions. Harold drove back to the Finch field and collected soil from a dozen locations, surface soil, deep soil, samples from the corners and the middle and everywhere in between. He labeled each bag carefully and drove back to the extension office. How long for results? University lab takes about 2 weeks. Costs $15. Harold paid the $15. Then he went home and waited. Let me tell you about the results, because they changed everything. 2 weeks later, Harold got a call from Paul Hendricks. You need to come see this. Harold drove to the extension office. Paul was waiting with a folder full of papers and an expression that mixed excitement with disbelief. I've never seen anything like this, Paul said, spreading the test results across his desk. Look at the pH readings. Harold looked. Each sample had a number next to it. 4 sample after sample, all showing the same thing. What does that mean? It means your soil is incredibly acidic. Normal agricultural soil runs between 6.0 and 7.0. Yours is below 5.0 across the entire field. That's almost like battery acid compared to what crops need. Is that fixable? Absolutely. You just need lime. Agricultural limestone. Spread it on the field, work it into the soil, and it neutralizes the acid over time. Farmers do it all the time. Then why didn't anyone do it here? Paul shook his head slowly. Because nobody tested. Nobody asked. They just assumed the land was cursed, or dead, or unfarmable. They never bothered to find out why. Harold stared at the numbers on the page. 30 years, 3 families, a $15 test that nobody had ever thought to do. What would cause soil to get this acidic? Could be a lot of things. Natural geological conditions, decades of certain farming practices without proper management. There's an old strip mine about 5 miles from here. Runoff from that could have affected the water table years ago. Paul shrugged. Hard to say without more research. But it doesn't really matter why. What matters is that it's fixable. How much lime would I need? Paul did some calculations. For 120 acres at this pH level, you're looking at about 4 tons per acre. That's 480 tons total. At current prices, maybe $1,200. At current prices, maybe $1,200. $1,200 to fix a problem that had destroyed 3 families over 30 years. A problem that nobody had ever bothered to diagnose. I'll order the lime today, Harold said. Let me tell you about the first year, because that's when people started paying attention. Harold spread lime over the Finch field in the fall of 1969. He rented a spreader, bought 500 tons of agricultural limestone, and worked it into the soil over 3 weeks of long days and aching muscles. Then he waited. Lime doesn't fix acidic soil overnight. It takes time to react with the earth, to neutralize the acid, to create conditions where plants can grow. Harold knew this from his courses. He knew the first year might show only modest improvement. He planted a test crop in the spring of half corn, half soybeans, a standard rotation for Iowa. He didn't expect miracles. He got something better than miracles. He got progress. The corn came up thin and weak, not good, but not dead. For a field where nothing had grown in 7 years, thin and weak was a revelation. The soybeans did better, managing a modest yield that would have embarrassed a normal farm but represented absolute victory on the cursed field. Harold harvested what he could and spread more lime. The second year was better. The corn grew taller, the soybeans healthier. Yields were still below county average, but they were real yields, actual crops worth actual money. The third year was better still. By 1973, the cursed Finch field was producing at 70% of county average. By 1975, it hit 90%. By 1977, it was above average. Glenn Mercer drove out to Harold's farm one afternoon in July of 1970. The field that had been brown and dead 8 years earlier was now a sea of green corn, tall and healthy, rustling in the summer breeze. Glenn stood at the edge of the field and didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, "How?" Harold shrugged. "I tested the soil." "That's it? You tested the soil?" "That's it. The pH was too low, way too low. Nothing could grow, because the ground was essentially poisoning everything planted in it. I spread lime for 3 years, neutralized the acid, and now it grows fine." A soil test. $15. County Extension Office. Takes 2 weeks. Glenn looked at the corn, then at Harold, then back at the corn. 3 families went broke on this land. I knew all of them. Good people. Hard workers. They lost everything trying to farm this field. I know. And all it needed was a soil test. All it needed was someone to ask why. Everyone assumed it was cursed. Everyone assumed it was unfixable. Nobody ever tested it. What? Glenn was quiet for another long moment. "I laughed at you. When you bought this place, told you you'd thrown away your money. I remember. I was wrong. You were wrong about the field. You weren't wrong about what everyone believed. You just believed what everyone else believed. So did the 3 families who went broke here. They never questioned it. And you did. I asked a question. That's all. I asked why nothing grew, instead of accepting that nothing grew." Glenn looked at Harold with an expression that might have been respect, might have been embarrassment, might have been both. "A $15 question. That's what you're saying. A $15 question that nobody thought to ask for 30 years. That's exactly what I'm saying. Now let me tell you about the value of the land, because that's where the story gets really interesting." Harold had paid $80 an acre for the Finch field in 1969. That was less than half the going rate, because everyone knew the land was worthless. By 1975, the land wasn't worthless anymore. It was producing crops, healthy crops. The curse had been lifted. A real estate assessor came out that year to reevaluate the property for tax purposes. He walked the fields, looked at the yields, checked the soil reports. Then he sat down with Harold and delivered his assessment. "Based on current production and comparable sales in the area, I'd estimate this land at $400 an acre." Harold had paid $80. 6 years later, it was worth $400. A 5-fold increase. Not from any change in the market, but simply from fixing a problem that had been fixable all along. By 1980, the land was worth $600 an acre. By 1985, in the middle of the farm crisis, when land values everywhere else were collapsing, Harold's land held its value because it was producing. Unlike the farms bought on credit at inflated prices, Harold's land had been purchased cheap and improved through work. He had no debt. No bank breathing down his neck, no pressure to sell at a loss. By 1990, when the crisis was over and land values started recovering, the Finch field was assessed at $800 an acre. $800. Harold had paid 9,620 acres. 21 years later, the same land was worth $96,000 for 10 times his original investment, from asking a $15 question. Let me tell you about the neighbors, because they learned something too. Word got around about what Harold had done. In a farming community, nothing stays secret for long. By 1978, everyone knew the story of the cursed Finch field. Not the old story about the curse, but the new story about the soil test. Other farmers started showing up at Harold's place, asking questions. "How did you know to test the soil?" "I took some courses. Correspondence courses from Iowa State. They taught me that soil is chemistry, not magic. If something isn't growing, there's a reason. And the reason was too much acid. The pH was all wrong. Lime fixed it. Could my land have the same problem? I don't know. Have you tested it?" Most of them hadn't. They'd never tested their soil, never sent samples to the extension office, never asked why their yields were what they were. They just accepted what they got and assumed that was the best they could do. Harold started encouraging everyone to test. He drove neighbors to the extension office. He explained what the numbers meant. He helped them calculate how much lime or fertilizer they needed. By 1985, soil testing had become common practice in Clayton County, not because of any agricultural revolution, because of one man who'd asked a question nobody else had thought to ask. Paul Hendricks, the extension agent who'd processed Harold's original test, eventually became the county agricultural commissioner. He credited Harold with changing how local farmers thought about their land. Before Harold, Paul said at a county fair ceremony in 1992, most farmers around here treated soil like it was just dirt. Good dirt or bad dirt, cursed dirt or blessed dirt. Harold showed us it was chemistry. Measurable, testable, fixable chemistry. That one insight has probably increased yields across the county by 20% over the past 2 decades. Harold, uncomfortable with public praise, just shrugged. I took a course. I asked a question. That's all. Let me tell you about the last conversation with Glenn Mercer, because it happened near the end of both their lives. Glenn retired from the John Deere dealership in 19. His son took over the business, modernizing it, turning it into something Glenn barely recognized. Computers, precision agriculture, GPS-guided tractors, all things that would have seemed like science fiction when Glenn started selling equipment in 1952. A year after his retirement, Glenn drove out to see Harold. They sat on Harold's porch, 2 old men looking out at the Finch field, now green and productive for 27 years running. I've been thinking about what you did here, Glenn said, all these years, and I'm still thinking about it. What about it? About how we all just accepted that this land was cursed. How nobody questioned it. How 3 families lost everything, and the whole community just watched and shrugged and said, well, that's the cursed field. Nothing to be done. People believe what they're told, especially if everyone agrees. But you didn't believe it. I didn't accept it. There's a difference. I believed there was a problem. I just didn't believe the problem was supernatural. Problems have causes. Causes can be found. I learned that from books. Glenn was quiet for a long moment. I never read much, never had time, never had interest, figured everything I needed to know I'd learn from doing. There's a lot to be said for learning by doing. Sure. But doing only teaches you about what you've already done. It doesn't teach you about what you haven't tried yet. Glenn gestured at the field. Nobody in this county had ever fixed soil like yours. So nobody knew how. The knowledge was out there. It was in those courses you took, those books you read. But nobody here had it. We just kept doing what we'd always done, and getting what we'd always gotten. That's why they have extension offices. That's why they have university courses, to spread the knowledge around. And that's why they have men like you, to show the rest of us that the knowledge actually works. Glenn looked at Harold. I'm sorry I laughed at you. Back in 6, I was wrong. You apologized for that years ago. I'm apologizing again. Because I've thought about it more. I didn't just laugh at you. I laughed at the idea that you might know something I didn't. I laughed at a young man asking questions, because I figured questions were for people who didn't know any better. Glenn shook his head. Turns out, questions are for everyone, and the people who don't ask them are the ones who don't know any better. Harold didn't know what to say to that. They sat in silence for a while, watching the corn grow in the field that had been cursed. One more thing, Glenn said eventually. What's that? That $15. The soil test. I've been telling people about it for years. This young fool who spent $15 and broke a 30-year curse. You know what I realized? What? The test wasn't $15. The test was free. It was just knowledge, just science, just asking a question. The $15 was for someone else to do the asking because you didn't know how yet. But once you learned how, you could have done it yourself. You could have tested the soil with nothing more than some indicator paper and a bit of chemistry knowledge. I suppose that's true. It's not about the money, is what I'm saying. It was never about the money. The 3 families who went broke here, they could have afforded $15. Anybody can afford $15. What they couldn't afford was the idea that they didn't already know everything they needed to know. They couldn't afford to ask a question that might make them look ignorant. Harold nodded slowly. Pride's expensive that way. Pride's expensive. Assumption's expensive. Certainty's expensive. Glenn looked out at the corn one more time. When questions are cheap, damn near free, and sometimes they're worth more than 100 acres of good farmland. Let me tell you about Harold's legacy, because the story doesn't end with his death. Harold Finch farmed the former cursed field until 2008, when he finally retired at the age of 65. He'd never expanded beyond the original 120 acres. Never wanted to, he said. One field, properly understood and properly cared for, was enough for one lifetime. His daughter, Margaret, took over the farm. She'd grown up watching her father test soil, adjust pH levels, manage nutrients with scientific precision. To her, this wasn't revolutionary, it was just farming, just how things were done. But she knew the history. She knew that her father had done something remarkable, not by being smarter than everyone else, but by asking a question that nobody else had asked. The County Agricultural Society erected a small marker at the edge of the Finch field in Harold was 85 then, still sharp, still modest about what he'd done. He didn't want a marker, didn't want recognition, but they put it up anyway. The marker reads, "The Finch Field, for 30 years called cursed." In 1969, Harold Finch asked why. A $15 soil test revealed acidic conditions fixable with lime. This land has produced above-average yields since Sometimes the answer is a question. Harold died in 2019 at the age of 96. The obituary in the county paper mentioned his service in the Korean War, his 53 years of marriage to his wife Dorothy, his 2 children and 5 grandchildren. But the headline focused on something else. Harold Finch, who broke the 30-year curse on Finch Field, dies at 96. The field is still producing. Margaret runs it now, with help from her son Thomas, who represents the 3rd generation to farmland that everyone once said was worthless. Thomas took the same correspondence courses his grandfather took, updated versions, delivered by internet now instead of mail, but the same basic idea. Soil science, agronomy, plant biology, the chemistry of making things grow. My grandfather always said the most valuable thing he learned was how to ask questions, Thomas told a reporter who came to do a story about the field's history. Not how to farm, exactly. Plenty of people knew how to farm. How to ask questions. How to look at a problem and say why, instead of just accepting it. The reporter asked what question Thomas would ask about today's farming. Thomas smiled. "I ask a lot of them. That's the point. You never stop asking. Every field, every season, every crop, there's something you don't know yet, something nobody knows yet. The only way to find it is to ask." He gestured at the Finch field, green and healthy, producing crops that would have seemed miraculous to the families who'd gone broke there 50 years earlier. My grandfather paid $15 to find out why nothing grew here. $15 and a question. That's what it cost to break a 30-year curse. Imagine what else we could fix if we just asked the right questions. Let me tell you one final thing, because it's the thing that matters most. The curse was never real. There was no supernatural force keeping crops from growing on the Finch field. There was just acid in the soil. A chemical imbalance that killed everything planted there, year after year, decade after decade. But in another sense, the curse was absolutely real. It was real because people believed in it. It was real because 3 families lost everything without ever questioning the narrative. It was real because an entire community looked at a solvable problem and called it unsolvable. The curse was certainty. The curse was assumption. The curse was knowing what everyone knew, and never asking if everyone was wrong. Harold Finch broke that curse with a $15 soil test and a willingness to look stupid if it meant finding the truth. He wasn't smarter than the farmers who came before him. He wasn't luckier. He was just willing to ask a question that nobody else had asked. Why doesn't anything grow here? That's all it took. One question. $15. And the stubbornness to believe that problems have causes, and causes can be found, and found causes can be fixed. The next time someone tells you something is impossible, or cursed, or just the way things are, Remember the Finch field. Remember 3 families who went broke because they never asked why. Remember one young man who asked and found an answer and changed everything. Questions are cheap, assumptions are expensive, and sometimes the curse isn't in the ground at all. Sometimes the curse is in the not asking.